What you do on Sundays?
We talk about Cate Blanchett, the acting, the costumes, the awards, but mostly the Blanchett of it all.
I'm not acting.
You think this is a love affair?
I saw you, Erica. Meeting in the middle.
This is Sundays with Cate, and I'm your host, Murtada El Fadl. As I mentioned in last week's episode, I am adding a new element to the podcast this season. This week, we are taking a brief detour from the films of Cate Blanchett. Instead, we will be discussing a current film out on release now, Ammonite, plus the career of Kate Winslet, and in the latter part of the podcast, we will discuss a few other queer films out this season. I will be back to regular programming next week.
Cornu-Ammonis?
Ammonite.
Your skills are legendary.
I was under the impression that fine London gentlemen were no longer interested in my relics. Fashion moved on.
And for this conversation about Francis Lee's Ammonite, I am very excited to welcome Ren Gender, a queer writer, performer, producer, and you probably may have read some of her work in the New York Times, NPR, or Slate. Ren, so excited to have you. Welcome.
I'm glad to be here.
So we're going to talk about Ammonite. I wanted to talk about this movie because of two things. One is because Kate Winslet is an actor that I have admired for a long time. And I have felt that in the last decade or so, my admiration for her fell a little bit as opposed to her early work. But I thought with Ammonite, even though I have issues with the movie itself, that her performance was something that reminded me of her early brilliant work. And I thought it would be a good movie to discuss. So Ammonite is directed by Francis Lee and written by him. He's a director who made one previous movie that was called God's Own Country, and this was a 2017 movie. And Ammonite sort of takes a real historical person, Mary Anning, who was a paleontologist, and builds a narrative, a fictional narrative around her life. So it imagines this love story between her and a woman called Charlotte Murchison. Mary is played by Kate Winslet. Charlotte is played by Saoirse Ronan. There is evidence that Charlotte actually also existed and that she invited Mary to a weekend in her London home sometime when they were both alive. But beyond that, everything that's imagined in the movie is fictional, imagined by the director.
Charlotte Murchison actually was also, I don't know if they called them paleontologists then, but she also had an interest in geology and fossils, and it actually predated her husband's. And she even has, I know all this from Wikipedia. She has an Ammonite fossil that's actually named after her. The Latin name is whatever the Latin for Murchison is. That's the species name of that particular Ammonite. It sort of gets at things that bother me about the movie. They're so these women, is not just Charlotte Murchison, but also Elizabeth Philpott, who's also a real person, played by Fiona Shaw. They all had this common interest in fossils, and we're doing this together. And somehow there has to be a man in there who leads, Charlotte to marry Kate Winslet's character. And also just it seems I never know these rules of screenwriting, but it seems there must be some kind of rule that these characters must have tension. They must not have much in common or whatever. And actually, they had a lot in common. So
yeah. So, we were saying, so the story imagines the man in this case is Murchison's husband, who's played by James McArdle, and he basically comes into Mary's shop, fossil shop in Cornwall by the sea, because he heard of her. She was a well-known paleontologist, or let's call her a fossil hunter, since maybe, like you said, paleontologist was not a term then. But she was well known in the fossil circles, let's say. So he came to her store and then kind of like strangely asks her to take care of his wife. So the Ronan character, Murchison, is suffering postpartum depression. She has lost a baby. And so the husband kind of doesn't want to deal with her. So he's just like, oh, this fossil hunter woman, I think, can take care of her. Like, I think the movie doesn't...
Cure your depression.
Yes. She looks depressed. Maybe she can cure her.
Yeah. Even though like Kate Winslet in this role doesn't look like anybody who could like bring anybody out of their depression. You know, she's a very gruff character.
She is, yeah. And this is so unlike Kate Winslet, or at least unlike a lot of her characters. Like, she's very reticent here, and to your point, gruff and kind of mad. I don't know what she's mad about, but maybe just mad about what I found interesting, that maybe what she's mad about is that she's not as respected as she should be.
Yeah.
And so that to me was an interesting note to see Kate play, because she always, at least in my memory, in my mind, plays these very frank, open women that are sensual and sexual. But this is somebody who's repressed, who's mad. And, you know, that was a new note for me to see from her. And I enjoyed watching that.
Yeah, I don't know if I would call her repressed. I just, again, I think it's a little bit of a trope, like the gruff lesbian. It's very old fashioned kind of a trope. Like the last thing that I can remember that has it in it is Notes on a Scandal. The Judi Dench character kind of is this person, you know, who's like, you know, always in a bad mood and like, you know, never knows real love. Yeah. And so, you know, basically I went into this film not expecting much, and I still was kind of disappointed.
Let's dive into that. So kind of like what to me was disappointing about the movie was I liked the performance, but beyond it, I found the story very thin. I was more interested in Mary herself, not in this love story that is just plays to these beats that are once familiar and also not that interesting. So somebody's depressed, somebody's taking care of them, and then they fall in love, even though at the beginning there's a little bit of misunderstanding where the Kate Winslet character, Mary, thinks that maybe Saoirse is interested in Fiona Shaw's character, and then Saoirse goes and says, no, you're the one I'm into. And then because
nobody ever says anything directly in this film, ever.
Yeah. So do you agree that the kind of like the story was like, if you were going to imagine a fictionalized story, why this nothing story?
Yeah, well, I mean, basically, the fossils, I just have to say, even after seeing a film about them, are just not very interesting to me. You know? And so, like, you know, on one hand, I wouldn't see this film if it weren't for a queer love story. On the other hand, like, I would have loved for it to have been between Kate Winslet's character, Mary, and Fiona Shaw's character, Elizabeth Philpotts, because, of course, they lived in the same town. Like, they were real people who lived in the same town and were gathering fossils together. And if anybody got together, it was probably the two of them, you know, but oh well.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, Fiona Shaw is the one queer actor in the role. Yeah. The director-writer, Ralph, is queer, but Fiona Shaw is sort of like the queer woman, or at least that we know of.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and also she seems to be the only one whose life isn't like, you know, all about deprivation, which it seemed like both the other women, their lives were about. And to me, this is kind of a dehumanization of women in the past, when you like sort of make their lives like, you know, sort of devoid of joy. Because like no matter how hard, well, I shouldn't say no matter how hard, but like women's lives, you know, in the past were much harder than they were now. That's, you know, not something you can argue about. But like, they did find ways to get by. And to me, that's a lot more interesting than just, you know, to see, oh God, things were so hard. I can't believe how hard they were for women in those days. And it's also sort of condescending to the past, because of course, things are hard for women now too. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and so I feel like these films an awful lot of times are kind of, you know, saying to us, oh, you know, if only she had been born now, like she would have no problems at all. Yes, of course. Women in science, no problems whatsoever right now. You know, they never have their work stolen or anything.
Yeah, like I really think that's why I sort of wanted the movie, even, you know, despite taking your note about fossils, I kind of wanted the movie to be about the work because, like, to your point, even today as a paleontologist, probably somebody like Mary Anning wouldn't be respected or get the due that she is owed. And so to do it in the 1840s, that would have been even a more interesting story. Like the one scene very on at the beginning when Charlotte's husband came in, and the way that Kate Winslet sort of navigates that scene where she is sort of kind of a little bit interested because he is giving her compliments about her work, but also she continues to be gruff and not interested because, you know, he's a man who is in the field. So she has dealt with them before and kind of doesn't want to open herself to that. Like that to me was one of the more interesting notes in the script and in the performance. And I wanted to see more of that as opposed to just, you know, her taking care of poor Saoirse, who is depressed and sick.
You know, that's sort of, I guess, the build up to the two women having romantic feelings for one another is, you know, Saoirse Ronan's character is not only depressed, but she's also has a fever, you know, and in those days, of course, you know, there weren't any antibiotics. So it was kind of touch and go. If you had a fever, that might be the end of you. Yeah. And so, like, you know, Kate Winslet's character is taking care of her and seems to be, I don't know, sort of falling for her at the same time. And I have to say, like, in the early 90s, I took care of, you know, very sick people in their homes. And, like, it's not sexy. Like, it doesn't, like, you know, ignite sexual feelings in you to take care of somebody when they're sick. So I felt like that was, like, another misfire in a script kind of full of them.
And I don't know anybody who feels sexy when they're sick. So
exactly. Yeah. I mean, you might be like grateful to the person who's taking care of you, but like that's a little different than like wanting to get it on with them.
Yeah, unless this is a specific 1840s fever that we don't know.
Who knows?
You know, this movie, just because it is about queer people and it is from a queer director and it stars these two actresses that people love, like there was a lot of initial excitement for it, like at least amongst my friends, amongst people I talk to all the time. We were like, oh, Ammonite will be like this movie that we're all expecting. And then it came out. And the release was kind of, I think, a little underwhelming, but also like the first initial bout of media about it was all about the sex scene and how this is, you know, there's the story that the actress kept telling about how they choreographed the scene themselves. And there was this notes in the Hollywood Reporter cover story about how this puts Carol to shame, which is like whatever, but also it's just like they're trying to compare themselves to a queer movie, the last big queer movie that starred two women that people love. So that initial bout kind of just makes you wait for that sex scene. Like, what is this sex scene that they have been talking about for months? And then it comes, and you know, I'm not an expert, obviously, but it was good. But it also felt to me just like after all this build-up, like, is that all there is? You can't help but be like, is that all there is after all that build-up?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of problems. First of all, you know, a film's in trouble when like actors talk about what a great experience they had making it. That's like that terrible film with Anne Hathaway, Dee Reese put out earlier this year. I don't even remember the name of it, but like everybody was saying, "Oh, how great it was to be on the set."
The last thing he wanted.
Anyway, like I want actors to feel comfortable in their scenes, like including sex scenes. Like that's a bare minimum. But I also want the film to be good, which shouldn't be too much to ask. And like these two did not have chemistry. You know, they're very awkward with each other. The two characters also, like the build-up before they have sex is not. It doesn't really happen. They're not really like touching all that much. There's a little hand holding. They're not exchanging confidences. Again, these people barely talk to each other. And it's fatal to have a romance between two women where you don't have either one or the other. The sex scenes, like they kept my eyes from glazing over, but I'm not sure they're convincing, you know. And also when the two of them kiss, like I was noticing rewatched the film last night, they don't look like they're into it. Like it's extremely awkward. And I haven't really noticed that, with their scenes with male partners, in love scenes.
I do agree. Yeah, they don't really have chemistry at all.
No.
One thing I do give the sex scene as a positive is that, like Lawrence's previous movie, God's Own Country, the sex scenes, there is an urgency to them. They're not choreographed, like they're a little awkward, and there is a little urgency to them. And this is something that he has done before, and also something that, we've seen Kate Winslet do a lot of sex scenes. And to your point, she always had chemistry with the men. And so she's somebody who's adapted at performing sexuality on screen. And so I liked her performance, but I'm not sure that Saoirse Ronan helped her. And the chemistry was just wasn't there. And also I think the Charlotte character is so underwritten that I don't know what any actor could have done with it.
Yeah. I mean, she's basically there to react. Yeah, and it's not a well-written script. I wasn't fond of God's Own Country, but I did like the one scene where they have the orphaned lamb that they save, or rather the Romanian character saves. Like, that had a genuineness. It was very involving, even though it's like a silent scene. This film really needed that in the fossil hunting, because I totally was not feeling it at all. And also, like, the way that the men hooked up in God's Own Country, it kind of is parallel in this film. Like, it's sudden. Mm-hmm. And just, that's not the way women usually hook up. I mean, I don't know, maybe it was different in the 1840s. But the fact is, like, a comedian, Suzanne Westenhofer, actually made a joke about it. Like, she had played an Olivia Cruz. And she said, well, that's the thing about women. She said, like, it takes a week for them to get together as opposed to just going to, she was in Provincetown, the Dick Dock for 15 minutes. So, I mean, go ahead.
It was written by a man, so I guess that shows.
Yeah, well, and also, like, you couldn't, like, talk to some women. You couldn't, like, collaborate with some women, with some queer women. I mean, like, they're out there. I wasn't feeling so much of this film, just so much.
Another interesting, also, if he wanted to tell a love story, and to your point, Elizabeth Philpott was also a real woman who lived at that time. And just based on the fact that Fiona Shaw is so much more interesting as an actor and as a character in the very few scenes that she shows up. She literally has maybe 3 or 4 scenes. That would have also been a more interesting story, like two women in middle age maybe reflecting on their relationship or what might have happened if they were able to be together in the way that they wanted, instead of this sort of May-December romance that just starts out of nowhere and goes nowhere at all.
Also, that pairing between Fiona Shaw's character and Kate Winslet's character also has the same class tension. You can tell in the film that Fiona Shaw's character has much more money than Kate Winslet's does. Apparently that was true in real life as well. However, they got over it, apparently, through their shared interest in fossils.
So beyond Kate Winslet's performance, which I am very positive on, and I really liked her, and I think it was interesting to me to watch her in this movie and to sort of see her chart this woman's life in the quieter scenes, in the scenes of her own. Like, I think the scenes where she was just fossil hunting by the sea were more interesting to me than any scene where she was with Saoirse Ronan. Ronan is somebody I have admired a lot and liked her in a lot of performances, but this, frankly, is maybe the nadir of her career.
Yeah, well, I mean, my problem with Winslet's performance is that, this is somebody who's supposed to be, kind of cut off from other people, but she can't be cut off from the audience. And that's what I felt. Mm-hmm. There have been characters like Heath Ledger in Brokeback Mountain. Like, that's another cut off character, but, like, he's not cut off to the audience. And even Winslet herself, like in Revolutionary Road, she's very, like, resentful and kind of not really into her marriage and kind of being a woman in the 50s or early 60s, whichever it is, in the suburbs. She's alive to the audience. She's open with the audience. I felt like Kate Winslet was cut off from the audience, at least kind of cut off from me, and just, like, kind of isolated on screen. And that maybe, bled over into why Saoirse Ronan isn't anything special at all in this film.
You think maybe she wasn't giving her anything because she was playing such a reticent character that maybe she wasn't giving her something to play off?
Yeah, Winslet has said this in publicity, in an interview I heard earlier this week, that she wasn't really socializing or very open or, having much conversation with her co-stars because she wanted to be that character who was so cut off from other people. And that makes for kind of a dull movie.
Yes. So this is actually the word that's most associated with this movie. Like if you go on social media, or there's even like articles written about how dull this movie is. Like there is a very humorous article in Vulture where a writer, instead of reviewing the movie, she wrote a whole article about how she spent a dull evening with her girlfriend watching Ammonite.
Yeah.
So I think we both agree that it is a little bit dull. But was there anything that you liked about it? Like, I liked Winslet's performance. Was there anything that you took away from it that was enjoyable?
I think the main good things about it are the class tensions, and I would have liked to have seen more of that. The one really telling moment is when Charlotte and Mary are kissing, and Mary stops because the maid is in the room. And Saoirse Ronan's character says, "Oh, don't worry, it's just the maid. It's not like it's a human being. It's just the maid." She's a world away from, Mary, who isn't a servant, but like certainly isn't in the same,
social class.
Yeah, and doesn't have the money that this other woman has. So I think those things were the best things in the movie. At the same time, I don't know, I felt like more could have been done with that. Like, you're right that there is a tension between, Mary makes money from these gentlemen who buy her fossils. She's also, kind of erased by them. They put their own names on the fossils when they're in the museum or wherever they're being displayed, because of course they bought that right to put their own names on them. The thing is, like, there's so little in this film that I liked, and I also feel like Lee himself just does not have a connection to most of this material. In publicity, he's talked about that actually it was his boyfriend, I don't know if it's an ex or somebody he's still with, who had the interest in fossils. And it kind of shows, and also like the landscape. He said he was surprised, he hadn't spent much time by the sea, and so he didn't realize that, like, in order to schedule filming, you have to schedule around the tides. He didn't know about tides. He made a film like
he did not do research.
I feel like he's not really connected to this, and I'm, the cynical part of me is like, well, here in the U.S., you can actually get funding more easily for something that's about science, and maybe even, women in science might get you some extra funding. So I don't know if that's what happened, but he just didn't have a feel for this material at all. And like you said, it's just very thinly written. And I'm also very resentful that, like, he cast Gemma Jones in both this film and in God's Own Country. She played the mother, and she plays the mother in both films. And not only does she play the mother in both films, and I mean, this is somebody who, she's older now, and so she doesn't have like the hot career she did when she was young, but like she played the Duchess of Duke Street way back when, like 40 years ago. She was a star. She was a good actress. And like in God's Own Country, she's ironing. In this film, she's like polishing little figurines, and it's like, he asked himself, okay, so what do women do? Oh, wait, I know.
They iron and polish.
Yes, exactly. And I'm just, I want to see Gemma Jones do more than that.
I agree. She plays Winslet's mom, and I would have liked to see her do a little bit more. I also agree with you about that maybe Lee didn't have enough affiliation with the material, with the fossils, with maybe the ocean, as he did in God's Own Country, to the earth. Because I felt like he comes from Yorkshire. He has talked about growing up in a farm. And in that movie, you can feel that connection to the land, to the earth, that you do not feel at all in Ammonite. Everything in Ammonite is at a remove. Like, to your point, Kate Winslet though I liked her performance, she is at a remove. He is at the camera is at a remove. The emotions are at a remove. Everything is like you're looking at it from very far away, which sort of prevents the audience, to the point you were making earlier about Winslet's performance, from connecting to the story at all.
Yeah.
All Lee's choices here are at this remove. Like, the filmmaking is austere. The dialogue is minimal. There is not a lot. The costumes are very drab, and the settings are very drab. And like, these are not glamorous people, so it's not like we wanted gowns or colors or anything. But it's just all of these choices together add to this very dull movie. And, your eye can't go anywhere besides the performances, and only one, and maybe we can call it 1 1/8, because Fiona Shaw is in so little of the movie, kind of works. So what grabs the audience attention if everything is so drab and minimal, and there is no memorable line readings because there is not enough dialogue. There are no visuals because everything is sort of gray and at a remove. So it's just like, it's very hard to connect to this movie.
There wasn't a sense of discovery, not just of the fossils, but just, especially if he was unfamiliar with that landscape. Like, you don't even really see what's in the water. Like, you just kind of see, the pebbly beach and like an occasional like crab or whatever. Those shots where he has like insects and crabs and other things in the shot reminded me of sort of ripoffs of Andrea Arnold. And he's no Andrea Arnold. He should stick to just shooting the people. but there's no wonder in the film from anyone. Even though I think it actually is supposed to be conveyed by Saoirse Ronan's character, it doesn't come through at all.
Yeah. I mean, she tries, or at least in a couple of scenes where she is trying to sort of tell Mary how wonderful she is, or how she admires her work. But those, come too late in the movie to add any spark to it, or, to your point, wonder.
You're the most fascinating person there tonight. And I think the most beautiful.
I wanted to talk about the ending. So obviously these women, because of the historical record, it's not like he could suddenly fashion a happy ending to their lives. And frankly, once you see that story, you can't really see them ending together anyway. But to the point that you made earlier, basically the friction at the end is more of a class friction. And Mary sort of resents Charlotte for inviting her over to London and just assuming that she would upend all her life and move in with her to live in her big house, because she'll stay married and her husband, is not there that much, so they can just live their lives. And she decides to leave. And the end is in the British Museum, where then Mary goes and visits the fossils that she has collected and sees them displayed there. And it's very well done, that scene, I think, showing her looking at the fossils. But also I just felt like the metaphor was kind of too much on the nose. Like, I felt that he was saying to us that these women are still caged by, I don't know, the mores of the times, by the way society treats them, by class, by something. And I just felt it was very obvious and sort of undercut, even though I thought it was well shot and done. What did you think of the ending?
Well, it's part of what in the film rubs me the wrong way. Showing people caged is not particularly exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Showing, especially, in this context, it's not particularly well written. It's not particularly incisive. It's not particularly original. And it just, like I said, I feel like it's kind of dehumanizing, like showing pre-civil rights, all people of color is just, suffering, and this used to be a trope with queer people in general in films too, like suffering all the time. Now we more have it with trans people. And, hopefully it will stop in a while. It's not emotionally satisfying at all, but it's kind of insulting. That's something that I kind of felt about the whole film, actually. There's a quote Pauline Kael has about The Killing of Sister George, another lesbian movie I strongly dislike. And it's like, this is an exact, I always heard, there was no such thing as a happy lesbian, but I assumed that was male propaganda. Don't these women have any light moments? And I just thought that through the whole film, and really only Fiona Shaw is the one who has some light moments. Even though like one of her scenes, it's, she's quite good in it, but it reminded me of like the two of them when they're talking about their relationship, and what they did wrong. It reminded me of like seeing a couples counselor, maybe after you've decided to break up. It was very contemporary to me, like in a jarring way, and kind of funny. The whole film kind of plays this parody. Actually, you could easily make a parody of it and not really change much. And also a lot of like the cliches and tropes in it were already addressed by, Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which does right a lot of what this film does wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the funniest jokes, and this is not like a joke in the movie, but after watching this film, I was talking to a friend over text, and he, and we were talking about it, and he wrote to me, "Gay men don't understand lesbians and never will." And I think maybe kind of what we were talking about proves that point. I mean, Francis Lee is queer, but maybe he should stick to queer men. Not that we want to tell artists what to do and what not to do.
Both. It's true, but it's also sort of unforgivable, at the same time. Absolutely, he could absolutely understand queer women if he chose to, if he paid more attention to them, if he read some history. I don't know, if he saw, even, a completely fictional thing like a Portrait of a Lady on Fire, that there's just more, there's just more heart there, and there's more, sensitivity and more everything, more care.
And you wrote a wonderful article to the Times about Portrait of a Lady on Fire and what it does.
Yeah. And also, Rafiki, I know people were like, where are the contemporary films about queer women? And it's like, well, they're all over the place. You just didn't see them. And Rafiki is one of them from Kenya. It's actually a film about a love story about two women, and it's actually still banned in that country. It's a great love story, and it shows, I hate it when people say, oh, this queer love story is universal, but it does show sort of the process of first love, I think better than a lot of films do, even ones about straight couples.
And it also has that sense of joy that I think you were talking about that we lacked in this film.
Yeah.
To going back to Charlotte and Mary, like when you first fall in love with someone, there is an excitement there. There is the word that you said, wonder. And that was just not here. But to your point, it is really in abundance in Rafiki. Like that's a beautiful story about first love.
Yeah, I mean, she, the director, writer-director, whose name I'm not going to butcher, but she had talked about she even makes the colors brighter when the two of them get together, because that's kind of how you see the world, is as a better place, as a prettier place.
Ammonite, I say, if you are a Kate Winslet fan, there is things to enjoy. At least I did as a fan of her work. But otherwise, maybe, it's skippable. Do you agree, Ren?
Yeah, I mean, well, Kate Winslet was somebody I had a great deal of goodwill toward in her early career. Of course, she started out, I'd sort of forgotten, playing a queer murderer in
Heavenly Creatures.
She was very open in interviews, certainly then in the first part of her career, about the pressure to be super skinny, that she had been a fat child actor and then, had lost weight. And so she was cast in all these things. She went to the Academy Awards for Titanic. Joan Rivers called her fat, and then it was all over. Then she became another super skinny actress, and I've been less interested in her since then. Though she's, sometimes she comes back. She criticized a Photoshop cover of a magazine she was on, saying, her body looked nothing like that. When people have success very young, leaves them kind of sheltered. So also in interviews, she's wondered aloud if she's a feminist, which is really?
That was a few years ago though, right?
Yeah. But I mean, I think that was around when Revolutionary Road came out, because that's kind of a feminist movie. And, and she's worked with Woody Allen and Roman Polanski, though, recently she's expressed regret about that. So, like...
Yeah, I think, I agree with you about, like, her. I thought that when she first appeared in the mid-90s, she was such an exciting actor. Like, I remember Sense and Sensibility, like, it's a Jane Austen adaptation, but just the way that she played that, like, she brought sensuality to Jane Austen in a way that I haven't seen before in any other, or even since. Like, maybe people do a little bit more with Jane Austen or movies set in the past. Certainly, Portrait of a Lady of Fire did, but in '95, that sensuality that she brought to Austen, I thought was mesmerizing. Really loved that performance.
Why did you not tell me?
I could not break my word.
But Edward loves you. He cannot marry her.
Would you have him treat her even worse than Willoughby has treated you?
No. But nor would I have him marry where he does not love.
After all, that is bewitching in the idea of one's happiness entirely depending on one person. It is not always possible, we must accept.
Always resignation and acceptance. Always prudence and honor and duty.
Yeah, and I mean, and she looked terrific in all those period, costumes that she wore, in Heavenly Creatures and Sense and Sensibility, and to a lesser degree in Titanic, because like those dresses were kind of tacky. But that wasn't her fault.
No. Did you ever see her in Jude? So that was a movie that she did between Sense and Sensibility and Titanic. So it was the Thomas Hardy adaptation by Michael Winterbottom. And it's a movie, like, I think if people want to find something obscure for early Winslet, they should check out. She's very, like, Thomas Hardy does these sort of tragic women. So it's kind of in that trope. But I think also she just, similar to what she did in Sense and Sensibility, there was such a sensuality and verve to her and to her performance that was acting against the story and maybe against the director a little bit. And that tension was interesting.
I can remember her in Hideous Kinky.
Yes.
Which, again, that she was kind of fearless. She would do these nude scenes and this character who kind of doesn't know what she wants in life and is a hippie just wandering around that not necessarily, other young actresses would do.
What a choice. Like, that was her choice right after Titanic. That was literally the movie she made after Titanic. So I think she should get credit for those early career choices because, Titanic basically gave her world fame, and she decides to do a small indie movie like Hideous Kinky. I also like her when she worked with Jane Campion in Holy Smokes. Holy Smoke. It's only one smoke. Not smokes. Again, to what you were talking about, like in Holy Smokes, it's one of those fearless performances. Like, she is willing to go to, places other actors don't go. And there is a very funny anecdote that I remember from like a few years ago where she talked about that she was improvising with Harvey Keitel in that movie. And he just decided to perch on the floor and start barking. And so she's like, what am I going to do? So she's like, then of course I was barking back at him. So it's a funny thing about how, actors are mad, and sometimes they do mad things to get to these performances that then we see on screen.
Do they actually keep that scene in the film?
I don't know. That scene, I don't think it's in the film.
Okay, yeah. Good. Doesn't sound like a great scene, frankly. Probably was a lot of fun to do, but
Too many guys think I'm a concept, or I complete them, or I'm going to make them alive. But I'm just a fucked up girl who's looking for my own peace of mind.
Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, that was a movie that a lot of people loved. I'm not on the same wavelengths of whimsy as Michel Gondry, so I could take or leave that movie, but I think she's great in it.
Yeah, I agree with you. That's one of those films that actually, through the years, it's sort of gone up in my estimation. Its originality stuck with me. It's also a film with just an amazing cast, like besides Jim Carrey, who I don't really care for. But like everybody else in it is amazing and just have great careers.
Yeah, I mean, Kirsten Dunst and Mark Ruffalo and Jane Addams and Tom Wilkinson. And she's one of those actors who are associated with the Academy Awards because she's been nominated so many times, and she had that sort of narrative for a long time because she won on her 6th nomination. So people are always like, she even made fun of it in that Rick Gervais show where it's like, she went on and said, when is Winslet going to win one? And, literally did what, was a joke in that show, which is like, do a Holocaust movie and you'll win. And that's exactly what happened to her.
Yep.
She made The Reader. So,
which I've never seen, by the way. It just never appealed to me. Also, I never have wanted to see these films about like how Nazis are people too. Even before we had one in the White House, like, they're bad people, and I don't want to see films about them.
I mean, especially accidental Nazis, which is what The Reader is about.
Okay. That's like, I'm imagining like a cross between like The Reader and The Accidental Tourist. The two of them melding together. The Accidental Nazi.
But, I'm always wary of these sort of award narratives because like people like Glenn Close and Amy Adams are going through it this award season in that I don't think these actors like run their careers like I want to win the Oscar. And so they make choices here and there, and some of them have more power than others. And certainly people like Winslet and Close and Adams have had a lot of power at points in their career to, maybe not power, but at least choice as successful white women in an industry that maybe values that a little bit more than other actors. But still, like, I don't think that, she made The Reader just to win an Oscar, which kind of like was her narrative for a while. And it's sort of like you feel like people literally turning on her, especially somebody who was beloved and is like, when are you going to win one? And suddenly, like, because they say they maybe want to win one, everybody turns on them, which I think is a little unfair.
Well, I also think that it's something that happens to women much more than it does to men. Like,
absolutely.
I think somebody was, trying to dissect, like, when did we decide that we all don't like Anne Hathaway? And it had to do with, like, around the time. Didn't she win an Oscar? I don't even know.
Yes, she won. Yes, and that's when people turned on her, too. Same as Winslet. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's like, are these women like really all that dislikable, especially like when you consider the type of man who succeeds in Hollywood? I don't think so.
Yeah, absolutely. Leonardo DiCaprio, you could say the same thing about him. Again, I don't think like he made The Revenant just to win an Oscar, similar to Kate Winslet doing The Reader, but he was in the same boat, but yet nobody turned on him.
No, because he's a guy and he's allowed to do what he wants.
Yes. So in general, I think Kate Winslet has an interesting career. I think her earlier career is more interesting than her latter career. And I think, in my mind, Ammonite is an interesting choice for her at this point. And I think, hopefully, that I want to see that fearless actor that I so loved in Sense and Sensibility and Holy Smoke and all these earlier movies come back. And maybe she will. Hopefully she will.
Maybe she can kiss a woman in a film and look like she means it. I mean, it happened once. Not in Ammonite, but no, in Fierce Creatures, they kissed.
Heavenly
Creatures. Sorry.
So, if you want to recommend a Kate Winslet performance for our listeners, is Heavenly Creatures your choice, or is there something else you want to recommend?
I think so. Yeah, at that time, like, nobody knew who the fuck Peter Jackson was. It was before Lord of the Rings films. And it's like, oh yeah, this guy, he's pretty good, and she's just excellent in it. And also has that flair for wearing those period clothes. This takes place not all that long ago in the 60s, but still in the 60s or 50s, I forget which. But like she looks like she belongs in that era. Whenever she plays one of these roles, maybe not in Ammonite, but in everything else. That takes place in the past. When she puts on those clothes, they really take you back. She has, or maybe had, the kind of face that you could, kind of picture in those times, and not like sort of our current underfed actress times.
Yes. And so in this year, when availability of movies are kind of touch and go, like sometimes you don't know, like Ammonite I saw at a festival. I know it's out, but I think you can rent it in the US. there are other queer movies, if people want to check out, that are maybe more interesting. So, Ren, what other queer movies would you say people should see?
I can't tell you like how heartbreaking it is to me that like I'll see a good movie at a festival and I have no fucking idea when other people can see it. Like, and this is true for queer movies as well. Like one of the best documentaries I saw this year was No Ordinary Man about Billy Tipton. And it's a great movie that everyone should see. It has a lot of smart trans people, you know, commenting in a way that like, you know, is so far away from like all the like Twitter arguments or whatever. It feels like where the conversation should be instead of where it is an awful lot of times, especially in the media. And maybe because it is like smart trans people mostly talking among themselves and not like it's like the rest of us are overhearing, but we're not, you know, we're not in the conversation. I feel this about so many good queer movies that I've seen this year. I Carry You With Me, which is about the it's a combination of documentary and drama about the undocumented gay couple from Mexico. That's a fantastic movie. I guess it's supposed to be opening sometime in 2021. Who knows? Yeah. You know?
And I also loved I Carry You With Me. I saw it also at a festival. I saw it at the New York Film Festival. And I know that it was supposed to come sometime. I was excited for it to come out in December, but I think it's now, to your point, it's coming out sometime next year. But it is a beautiful movie. And what I also loved about it, it's like, it's a story, a real story about real people, similar to Ammonite. Like the two guys who fall in love, these Mexican immigrants who fall in love in Mexico and then come to New York separately and then meet each other again. They are real. And so the movie is directed by Heidi Ewing, who was a documentarian. And so she does mix the documentary and fictional narratives together. So you see the actual subjects of the film in sort of a documentary talking about their lives and their lives in New York today and how living here with no documents, stateless, and how they can't go back to Mexico. And at the same time, actors portray them when they are young and tell the beautiful love story, you know, at different stages of their life as children and as teenagers and as young adults, as they met and fell in love, and sort of like gives you this big, huge, like the movie is not long, but you feel like you know these people, you know all aspects of their lives. And so I think all of that is just put together beautifully.
And that is a film that's full of wonder and beauty.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Ren, for coming on the podcast and talking to me about Ammonite and the career of Kate Winslet. And before you go, can you let our listeners know where they can find you and your work?
Well, you know, this past year has not been the best for those of us who have been in media. I've mostly been in my apartment hanging out with my cats, and, you know, many of the places where my stuff used to be either, you know, don't exist anymore as opportunities for freelancers, or the editor left, or whatever. But I will be other places soon, I promise. So look out for my byline. It will be out there.
But in the meantime, people can find you on social media.
They can, yeah. And I mean, you know, if you want to look back in the olden times, like 2019, you can find my work, as you said in the intro, in the New York Times and on NPR. If you want to go back even further, on Slate.
And you can find me on Twitter at ME_says, and follow the podcast on Twitter and Instagram at Sundays with Kate. All previous episodes of the podcast are available at sundayswithkate.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. And until next time, thank you for listening.